I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, where we'll be discussing ways to automate your accounts payable and invoice processing with M-Files. My name is Kimberly Samuelson, and I'll be serving as your moderator today. First, I'd like to start with a few housekeeping items before we begin our session. By default, all of you are muted, so we won't be able to hear anything you say into your microphones. However, we very much welcome your questions. So please use the questions window in the GoToWebinar right-hand pane to submit them. Secondly, we will answer all of your questions at the end of the webinar. However, there's a few we may not get to, but we will respond to those by email. Thirdly, we'll be posting a recording of this webinar so you can view it again or pass it along to a colleague, and you'll get a notification when it's posted. So please look for the "Thank you for attending" email. Finally, the presentation looks fantastic when you have a full screen view. So I highly suggest you enable it by clicking on the Zoom button, which is on the top left-hand side of your screen. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Stephen O'Neill. Stephen is a sales engineer here at M-Files. His background includes over 20 years in enterprise information management consulting. Stephen specializes in enterprise content management, business process management, and business intelligence. Stephen, thanks for presenting today, and feel free to begin.
Thanks, Kimberly. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen O'Neill. I'm working here with M-Files. I've been an ECM consultant for the last 15 years, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us to talk about M-Files Enterprise Information Management Solution and how we can help you address accounts payable and invoice processing. So let's get started and talk a little bit about M-Files. So how does M-Files position itself in today's enterprise content management industry? If you look at the industry as a whole today, you'll notice that we've got a couple of different types of solutions out there today. On the left-hand side, you'll notice that we've got solutions like Windows folders and Dropbox, Box. These solutions are focused on being very easy to use, but they tend to be somewhat limited in features and functionality. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got ECM systems that have extremely deep feature sets, but sometimes can be extremely complicated and expensive. M-Files is really focused on providing a solution that spans these two types of solutions. So we're focused on providing a very easy solution to not only for users to embrace and use, but also for the IT and administration staff to be able to get up and running and deploy very quickly and very easily, with a very complete feature set that allows you to meet those complex types of applications such as accounts payable and invoice management. When we start to look at accounts payable and invoicing as we start to talk to our customers, we tend to find a number of common themes in the business issues around this particular area. Mainly the slowness and inefficiency of dealing with this type of particular type of data. Often we find that information about invoices can reside in multiple different locations, so I'm going to have some information that may be sitting off in my ERP, my accounting system, some information that may have been scanned in and sitting off in some other area. So these are key issues. The paper and manual processes we also tend to find tend to be add to the inefficiency, and when we look at this from a management perspective, we also can find that management's visibility to be able to see what's going on from an accounts payable perspective can be often very poor, and there's always a need for security. So with that, what we'd like to do is Kimberly's got a few questions for the audience before we get started.
Yes, we do. Now that you've heard a little bit about us, now it's time to ask you some questions about your usages of the accounts payable and ERP. So I'm going to launch the first question. What ERP solution do you use? Do you use Dynamics Great Plains? Do you use Sage? Do you use NetSuite? Do you use Oracle? Or do you use others? I'm going to let that run for a few minutes. I'm going to close the poll in about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to share the poll. Ooh, looks like the majority of our attendees use another solution. And the next amount use Dynamics Great Plains, and then Sage and Oracle come in. All right, we have another question for you. You'll bear with me just 1 second. And your accounts payable process is primarily, please select one, paper-based, electronic documents, or a combination of both. Let the voting go for another 5 seconds or so. Oh, this is interesting, Stephen. Okay, I'm going to close it. And then I will share. So it looks like a majority of you are actually using both paper and electronic documents to manage your accounts payable process. And then secondly, mostly paper-based. And thirdly, are primarily electronic. That's interesting. Okay, Stephen, I am going to hand the presentation back over to you.
Thanks, Kimberly. And that's pretty consistent. Both of those topics point to what we've seen for our customers asking for, both in terms of integration with those types of systems, Great Plains, Sage, SAP. So we see a broad spectrum of systems and the requirement to be able to talk to those systems. And we also see customers that typically are in transition trying to deal with not only paper but also electronic documents. And so sometimes we see a lot of information coming in from a variety of different places. So we'll be talking through that a little bit more as we go through the rest of the presentation. So let's move on to some of the AP and invoice processing benefits that we see from using the mFile solution. Number one, specifically around that paper information that we talked about during the survey, how can we capture that paper-based information, get it to digital, and enable and make that processing much faster. Also, how can we integrate that information into your existing business systems? This is something that when we are able to provide that level of integration with that existing business system, this is one area that tends to make things much faster for organizations. The ability to automate the review and approval process is very key. So the idea that we can make sure that we're including the appropriate stakeholders and making sure that they are reviewing the specific items on the invoice. And oftentimes we may have multiple participants that need to be able to review and make sure that information, that goods and services were delivered, that they were not damaged. So there's often a need to be able to automate that in a very efficient sort of a way, and be able to protect that sensitive information to make sure that only the appropriate people can see that information as necessary. And a really key element of, as we'll see from the case study at the end of the slide deck here, is the ability to participate in this process and access this information from any device. And we're seeing an increasing amount of users that need to be able to participate in these types of processes who are road warriors, who are on the move, who need to be able to approve an invoice or approve a line item on an invoice from their mobile device. So that's something that we'll talk about and something that mFiles does very well. So first off, let's talk a little bit about that transition from paper to digital information. That whole idea that invoice information comes in not only in paper information, less and less we're seeing that information is coming in through traditional snail mail, but we still have those paper documents and paper invoices that we need to deal with. We're seeing information being scanned in from a variety of different scanners and multifunction devices. A lot of information comes in via email, and we still see information coming in via fax as well. So this is a key area where we can be able to bring all this information in regardless of where it's coming from, what delivery mechanism is being used to capture it, that we can capture it and we can manage it in a very consistent way. And this really cuts down on errors and really helps to save time when we're talking about how this information is going to be processed further down the line. Also, the ability to integrate with other business systems. So these are going to include some of the systems like that were brought up in the questionnaire. So, for example, SAP, Great Plains, Salesforce.com, NetSuite, ConnectWise. These are all systems that we can work with. We also see customers, for example, that are using systems like JD Edwards. So we take a very light and nimble approach when being able to integrate with these types of systems, as opposed to vendors in days past that tended to have very heavy integrations. M-Files, by the way that it's architected, integrates very easily with these types of systems. And that allows us to see the information. We talk about a 360-degree view of that information. It means that not only am I going to be able to see the documents that are living in M-Files, the invoices, the credit memos, and other accounts payable documents, but I'm going to be able to see their relationships to other documents, to the purchase order, to the other unstructured content that may be living in other systems as well, and you'll see that as part of the demo. One of the things that M-Files is really strong with, and if you take a look at what the industry analysts are saying about M-Files, it's our ability to manage the unstructured information as well as the structured information, and to be able to bridge that. In this case, it's primarily around invoices, but we see that in other areas. If, for example, if we were talking to someone about managing customer relationship data, it might be a contract. For accounts payable, that tends to be an invoice. It might be a purchase order. That whole idea that we've got the unstructured content, the actual invoice, the scanned document, and being able to associate that to the structured information on the ERP side. And as I go through the demonstration, you're going to see exactly how we do that. Automating the review and approval process. So this is an area, and depending upon which system you're using, if you've ever tried to configure, for example, and I'm going to pick on one system, it's not because I'm just going to pick on, let's say, for example, SAP. If you've ever tried to configure a workflow in SAP, then you know that creating a workflow in that type of a system can be very, very difficult. This is one of the areas where M-Files brings a lot to the table in terms of being able to save time, not only in the initial creation of those accounts payable processes, but also in the ongoing maintenance. So when you want to change your process and you want to be able to make it, you want to be able to keep up with changes in your environment, you're going to be able to do that, and you're not going to have the lag time that you might have with existing systems. Also, this increases your visibility. So as management or department heads need to be able to look at the information and track what's going on through dashboards or other reports, we can do that very quickly and very easily with the M-Files system. Reporting is a very important part, and so as I mentioned, dashboards and reports are a very key part of how we can do that. And you'll see some examples of those as I go through the presentation. Invoice processing workflows vary from organization to organization, and this is a very, very simplified view where we've got the new invoice that's coming in, it's waiting on approval, maybe we need to set an assignment for the approver, we need to allow them to reject or approve it, and then we're going to go ahead and finalize that in your ERP of choice. In this case, we're talking about SAP, and we need to be able to notify different people along the way. And at a high level, this is really what an accounts payable process is trying to do. Now, obviously, an accounts payable process in your organization different than this, and you're probably going to have multiple levels of approval. Perhaps you might have different levels of approval based on the amount of the invoice or which department the invoice was focused on. So these can all be built into the M-Files workflow as needed. Another key part is making sure that we're adhering to your compliance guidelines, and that's going to vary from organization to organization and from industry to industry. So that means that you may have to comply, for example, with HIPAA regulations or other regulations that your organization may be required to adhere to. M-Files as a solution allows the ability to manage that information by users, by groups, as well as by metadata-driven permissions. And this is a very unique capability, unique to M-Files. So the idea that I could say this document needs to be routed to Stephen O'Neill, and I need to make sure and grant him a specific level of access during his review cycle, and then when it moves on, I want to be able to go ahead and take those rights away. So that metadata-driven permissions is something that's very easy to configure within the mFile solution. Very easy to set up and administer that on an ongoing basis, and to change that. So if next on the next invoice it was somebody else, then that's very easy to configure and set up as we go through the process. Being able to access this information from any device is a very key part of the mFile solution. So whether that's my desktop, whether that's a web browser if I'm logging in from home, if that's my tablet device, if that's my cell phone. So for example, when I'm traveling on mFile's business, one of the things that I'll do is I'll capture all of my invoices, and I'll just take pictures of them using my device, and I'll go ahead and save them right into the mFile system. So for example, in this sort of a user scenario, I might need to be able to be notified that an invoice has come across my desk for approval. I can review it. I can go ahead and approve it right there and then directly from my mobile device. Also allowing me to work with offline access. And what that means is that if there's certain information that I'm going to need to review or work on while I'm out of the office, if I want to work on a contract, I can designate information for offline access, and I'll be able to take it with me on the road and work with it while I'm out of the office, even on an airplane, because even while I'm disconnected from the internet, because I have that offline access capability. When we start to look at a high-level diagram of how we integrate with an accounts payable solution, we start to look at what does an accounts payable solution look like. There's a number of different pieces that we will take into account. So for example, there's the capture solution. We tend to focus, because invoices come in all flavors and sizes, we tend to focus on advanced capture solutions because every invoice is going to look very different from vendor to vendor. So an advanced capture solution, and I'm going to show you an example of that, is going to allow us to recognize different types of invoices and use a variety of different technologies to match information such as who's this from, some of the line item details, what are the totals, subtotals, tax amounts, totals, etc. So as you see the examples of that, you'll see how these advanced capture solutions work, as well as capturing information that may be coming in from other sources as well, mail, fax, multifunction devices. Once that information is captured using the mFiles for AP import capability, it makes its way into the mFiles for AP vault. And what we're going to do here is we're going to be able to associate that to your ERP data using our integrations with those ERP systems. So for example, I'm going to be able to, in today's example, I'm going to be showing you Great Plains, and we'll be able to associate it with the appropriate vendor, the appropriate purchase order that are coming directly from that Microsoft Dynamics for GP integration. And then of course we've got on the far right hand side, we've got the ERP solution of choice, and this is where the mFiles for AP ERP integration provides that middle ground where we can make sure and exchange the information bidirectionally with that type of system. One case study that we'd like to talk about, Nutiva, is a customer of ours, and they use our system not only for accounts payable and to manage their accounts payable approval process and inventory management process, but we have a number of customers or a number of those users that are actually using it on the go. So their use case was that they needed to be able to approve this information while they're on the road. We've had a lot of success with this customer, and we have a case study that's been written up specifically about them. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the demonstration. So if you'll bear with me for a second, we'll go ahead and get started. So what you're seeing right now is the mFiles for AP solution. If you've never seen the mFiles solution, I'm just going to give you a quick guided tour of what you'll see over here. So this is the mFiles user interface. This is the desktop user interface, and you'll notice that over here off to the far left-hand side, I've got a number of different buttons that allow me to navigate through the system. So for example, if I want to go in and add new documents or invoices, add new people to the system, I have my new functionality right there. I'm always able to navigate and go to my home page as well as my assignments, any documents that I may currently have checked out, or even documents that I've recently accessed are going to be immediately accessible right there from within the system. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about how we're going to navigate to this information using what we refer to as dynamic views. One of the unique features of the M-File solution is its ability to and its focus on the use of metadata. And when I say metadata, you'll notice that we've got these common views that are here in the middle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to use metadata to create and display this information through what we refer to as these dynamic views. So you'll notice that I've got invoices, I've got vendors. So for example, if I was to click on one of these over here, you'll notice that I've got a travel company, and it's showing me all the information about that travel company. If I click on an invoice, it's going to show me all the metadata about that invoice. So this is a key differentiator of the M-File solution, is this idea that we're going to manage information based on the metadata. Really, what is the document? What type of document is it? And based on that type of document, in this case it's an invoice row, what information do we need to know about that particular object within the system? Very different than traditional systems that may use a hierarchical folder-based approach where it's all about where I put the document in the system. We're more focused on what type of an object is it and what information do we need to capture about it, and that's what allows us to drive these views within the system. So you'll notice when I come over here, for example, and take a look at my view of vendors, then you'll see that I've got all these different vendors, and this is coming directly from my ERP system. Now, the whole idea here is that we want to be able to capture enough information about your vendors so that we can match them within the system and make sure that we're capturing all the appropriate relationships. So in this case, it might be the name of the vendor, some basic address information, and any other information that might be necessary. So this would be configurable in your environment as necessary. So you'll notice that we've got our travel company, and if we go over here and look at the dynamics, so I'm going to be using dynamics as our example today, and if I go over here and look at the vendor card and just do a quick lookup on that particular vendor, you'll see that I've got my A travel company. And so one of the things that we'll want to be able to do is we'll want to be able to make changes as changes are being made to vendors, as new vendors are getting added to the system, as changes are getting made to the vendor within the system. We're going to want to be able to make sure that information is being migrated or captured within the M-File system, synchronized, if you will, within the M-File system. So as we make changes in the ERP system, we're going to want to make sure that those changes get captured appropriately within the M-File system. And this is based on a synchronization module that we provide that allows us to capture that information. So this could be vendor information. If I go back to my home screen, you'll also notice that I have, for example, purchase orders. So when I want to be able to match invoices against purchase orders for the two-way or three-way matching, this is where I'll be able to capture that information. And this is going to facilitate that whole process of, once I've got an invoice within the system, how do I go ahead and facilitate the matching and or approval of that appropriate information? So that's how we'll synchronize and work with your existing system. Now, if we go into invoices, one of the things we'll talk about here is how do these invoices make their way into the system? So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more about advanced capture. So I'm going to switch screens, and we're going to take a look at an advanced capture solution that we work with called ChronoScan. Now, there's a number of different advanced capture solutions out there in the marketplace, and we work with many different ones. So for example, there's products like Kofax, Captiva, a number of different solutions that will essentially do the same types of things, which are things like this. So for example, if I'm taking a look at an invoice, it's going to do some things like this. It's going to capture information such as who is the vendor, what's the order number, what's the invoice date, and basic information such as amount information. Now you'll also notice over here on the right hand side we've got some line item details, and so let's just take a close look at one of these invoices and see what it's doing. So an advanced capture solution is going to do some things like this. You'll notice that it's gone ahead and highlighted different areas. So for example, the advanced office systems area is being highlighted over here. So it understood two things. Number one, how to recognize that this was an invoice from the advanced office systems. How to recognize the fact that we had an invoice number here. So you'll notice that it's highlighted that and it's showing me how it recognized it. And we've got business rules that are built into the pattern matching of this specific invoice so that we can go ahead and pick up this specific number. In cases, for example, where this invoice number needed to be validated, then there can even be some additional logic in here to go ahead and appropriately validate that invoice information. Then you'll notice that we've got some logic in here that's, as part of recognizing this invoice, went ahead and actually broke the line item detail down here. And so you'll notice that that's showing up over here off on the right-hand side. So it's actually captured the line item details, the totals, the balance, and then you'll notice that down here towards the bottom, it's capturing subtotal, sales tax, and total information. Now, because this information is going to change over time. We're going to get new invoices over time. Invoice formats are going to change, and we're going to have new vendors that are going to get added to our system. We need to be able to recognize that, for example, in this case, maybe Advanced Office System isn't a vendor that we've worked with before. So it may use the business rules to go in and capture as much of this information as it possibly can, and then from that point might flag this document as a document that needs further interrogation. This is where I could come in and I could actually say, oh, well, for example, the sales tax was in this location, and this is where I could come in and I could actually drag and drop and create my sales tax zone here. So what we can do is we can start to train the system how to recognize new areas of information, new zones of information on new invoices that are getting added to the system. Once this information has been captured, what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to hand it off to the M-file system. So in this case, we've got 3 invoices. So the idea is that I'm going to take those invoices. They're either going to be coming in via a variety of sources. They're going to be making their way into this advanced capture solution. We're going to automatically detect which invoices, how many pages are associated with the invoice. Then we'll go ahead and hand it off to the M-file system. And then at that point, that's when M-Files will take over, and we'll be starting here. So now what we'll be able to do, let me pull up the right screen. There we go. All right, now we've got our invoices. So what's going to happen now is now that these 3 invoices have made their way into the M-file system, you'll notice that we have them captured in a variety of states. So in this case, we've got one where the invoice has been captured as received, one that's been set up in validation, and another one that's waiting on validation. Now this is going to be based on your business rules. So the idea here is that as documents, as invoices make their way into your system, we are going to be able to automatically match those invoices depending upon your appropriate business rules. So in this case, we went ahead and said that this invoice was received, but maybe there was some additional information that needed to be validated or captured, and so we've not moved it on to the next state, which would be waiting for validation. The next state after that would be invalidation, and you'll notice that as is part of the invalidation process, what we've got a couple things going on here. So first of all, if I take this invoice and I break it down into its component parts, we're going to see a couple things. Number one, we're going to be able to see the actual invoice that it's attached to. And you'll notice over here on my right-hand screen, I'll be able to actually get a preview of that specific invoice as well as all the information. So I can see over here using the tabs off to the right-hand side, not only the metadata, but also the preview of the document. So that's the invoice itself, but it's broken down based on the capture from the advanced capture solution. We've also been able to go ahead and capture the invoice rows. And so based on those invoice rows, now we're going to be able to see that we've got a couple of rows where the information has been already approved, and we've got other information, for example, this line item, that's still waiting on validation. Now this is going through the workflow process. So this specific line item, what we've got here is we've got the invoice that is in validation. We've got the invoice rows that are currently, in this case, we've got 2 that have been approved, and we've got 1 that's currently waiting on validation. While I'm selecting that particular invoice row, you'll notice that I've got a number of states over here off to the left-hand side that will allow me to make the transition. So for example, I could move this into waiting for approval. If I wanted to forward this on to somebody else for approval, I could go ahead and approve it. I could decline it. Or in the case, maybe let's say that this was, the information was damaged, and I wanted to be able to go ahead and recognize a credit for this particular line item, I could do that. And again, this is where we get into some more of the specifics about each organization's accounts payable process and what you might need to be able to do. For here, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and approve this and move it on to the next state. And at this point, I could say, I could provide some comments if I wanted to, such as reviewed the content and goods You probably won't do that for every line item, but I have the ability here, as you can see, to go ahead and make those comments as necessary. And at that point, when I approve that, now what's happening is that the system is in the background, it's doing some things for me. So as a part of approving that specific line item, based on the business rules that we've got configured within the M-File system, now what we've been able to do is go ahead and we can see that we've gone ahead and approved that specific invoice. So we didn't have to approve the invoice specifically. What we were able to do is, based on the fact that all 3 invoice rows were now approved, it went ahead and automatically switched this invoice into the state of approved. And that's using the pre and post conditions and the business rules logic that we've got configured within the M-Files workflow. So now we'll be able to see that a couple things have happened. Number one, as a part of approving that specific invoice, it's gone ahead and assigned a voucher number. So this is part of our integration with the ERP system. So in this case, in Great Plains, we're going to be able to go back into Great Plains, and we're going to be able to see that information and see a lot more information. We're going to be able to actually review that specific invoice and how it was appropriately captured. Now, I just want to make one other quick point, and that is that I showed the advanced capture solution, which is Chronoscan. Some of you who are using the M-Files product or maybe working with the M-Files solution today may be aware of the fact that we also have now M-Files Capture. And M-Files Capture is also is another solution that we have that can work with this type of data. So as you start to talk to existing customers or customers that are looking at the M-File solution, M-Files Capture solution may be another opportunity for us to take a look. And it really just depends on the type of invoices that you're processing and what your processing requirements are. And in some cases, if your organization is already using a specific capture solution. So with that said, let's talk a little bit more. You'll notice a number of things here. If we take a closer look at this invoice, you'll notice that as part of the matching process, it did a couple things for us when this invoice came into the system. Number one, it went ahead and matched this to the specific purchase order. So that purchase order has different information here specifically about it. So if I click on that purchase order, we can see that it was associated to a specific vendor, and we have the information about it here. As well, I can see the relationship to the specific vendor. So this is that 360-degree view, that ability to capture and manage the information about the different invoices or other objects within the system, whether those are invoices that have been scanned and put into the system or information about different objects that we may have synchronized with your ERP system. So let's switch over now and talk a little bit more about Dynamics GP. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over here and we're going to take a look at this invoice that was approved, and we're going to take this voucher number and we're going to use that to come over here and find this specific invoice within Dynamics GP. So now we're going to come over here and we're going to do an inquiry within the system for transaction by document, and we're just going to go ahead and fill in that voucher number. And when I do my redisplay, you'll see that that voucher number shows up in the system. So what happened was, is as part of the M-Files process, when we reached the appropriate point of approval within that process, we went ahead and pushed into this system, into GP, this voucher number. And so we got this assignment, this connection was made, and now what we can see is that we've got a connection between the payable system and M-Files. So for example, when I go ahead and pull up this document, you'll notice that I've got some additional things as part of the M-Files integration. So for example, I can come over here and under additional, I'll be able to view the invoice directly from within the Microsoft Dynamics GP system. So I can go view invoice, and what it's going to do is it's going to open up M-Files, and it's going to show me that invoice, and it's also going to show me all of the other objects and relationships for that specific invoice, including the invoice itself. Now, if I just wanted to see the invoice specifically, then I have another way to do that, and I'll show you that here in just a second. So let me close this. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to come over here to additional, and I'm going to say open invoice. And what this is going to do is this is going to open the file directly in the application of choice, in this case Adobe PDF. So now we can see this particular invoice, and I'm going to have, so the user may not even have M-Files on their desktop, and they'll be able to just open that document directly and access it as necessary. So once we've done that, so this can manifest itself in a number of different ways within your ERP solution. So we're showing a very simple example here where we're looking up an invoice, but it could be that I want to see, for example, all of the information, all of the invoices for a particular vendor. So the way that we can do that is by adding these additional integration items into the system that you're working with. In this case, Dynamics GP. So we can go in and we can change the context so that as I'm looking at different areas within the system, if I'm looking at vendors or if I'm looking at purchase orders, that I can go ahead and make inquiries directly into the M-Files system that allow me to see different pieces of information directly from M-Files. And this is really where we really get to start to understand the power of the views within the M-Files system. So the idea that we're using this metadata, so for example, we've got this vendor relationship. So these metadata fields allow us to very quickly and easily drive these different views that we see here and all of the different information. So for example, if I want to navigate into documents by class, I can see that very quickly through just this dynamic view that I've got a quick and easy way to drill into all of the specific invoices, credit row documents, credit memos, any of the types of documents that we have within the system. And these views are very easy to configure and add additional logic to depending upon what it is that I'm trying to do. So for example, if I wanted to have other types of views that allowed me to see information about contracts that I may have at different levels of the process, then I'll be able to manage those as well. Now, one of the things that I'm going to just quickly talk about is the ability to create these workflows. And the idea, so this is something that as a user will never see, but this is something that happens in the background. So what we've been looking at and what we've been viewing is essentially a workflow process that was defined in the background by an administrator who said, I want to be able to, when we receive that invoice, I want it to automatically go into waiting for validation, and then based on additional business rules, I wanted to have it transition to different steps as necessary. And so as part of this, I'll be able to go in and specify who can perform those tasks, what security changes are going to need to take place, and all of the different actions that are going to be happening as we go through this process. So with that said, we're running a little ahead of time, so I thought what we might do is go ahead and move on into the Q&A session and see what additional information we might, or what some of the questions are coming in from the audience.
Sure. So again, please use the question and answer box, and as time permits, we will answer all of the questions that we can with Stephen here live. Oh, and I think we're also being joined by Mika J., our Director of Product Marketing, or Product Management rather. So let's just launch into the questions. First question, Steve. How does M-Files allow me to avoid payment penalties or late payment fees?
Oh, that's a great question. And so one of the ways that we can do that is by creating these. So I was talking a little bit about these dynamic views. And so by taking, for example, some of the information, so if I was to go in and look at the specific invoice and look at the purchase order, oftentimes purchase orders may have different date-based information, such as the date that the purchase order was received, or other information that might be related to the specific invoices. So we can create dynamic views for this type of date-based information that allows me to see the invoices, the purchase orders, and often even contracts, so that they're being displayed in a very dynamic sort of way. For a contracts administrator, often this equates to a dashboard that allows me to see all of my contracts and see maybe perhaps terms and conditions of those specific contracts, payables, durations, for example, or net terms and conditions that would require me to make sure that the information is paid by a certain period of time. So by creating these dynamic views, we'll be able to create those dashboards that would allow people to avoid those penalties and make sure that information is being paid on time. Another way that we can do it is so the workflow process that I showed you earlier, so for example, if I might want to be able to include as part of that process additional notifications or a different alerts that the document was not paid and within a specific period of time, those can be easily configured as part of the workflow process to make sure that that document is being responded to, that invoice is being responded to in a timely manner. Great question, Kimberly. Thanks.
Okay, got another one. How do we assign workflows to specific individuals?
Oh, that's a really great question. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump back over to my workflow view here. So each of these workflow items that I'm seeing, and again, I just want to emphasize the fact that this is not something that an end user would see. This is really kind of a peek back into the background where I can go in and I can configure exactly how this process works. But I have the ability to come in here and specifically say that as part of this specific step, I want to be able to assign this to a specific user. And when I come in and I mark this assignment, I can go in and I can add it to a specific user. I can even use metadata. So for example, if this invoice had a specific contact name on it, I would be able to go in and assign that to that specific user and even include an assignment description in here. So this is all easy to configure. There's no scripting involved. This is basically just a point and shoot sort of a configuration. I've worked with a number of other workflow systems in the past before my life at M-Files, and I'll say that this is hands down the easiest workflow system that I've ever worked with. There's the ability to come in and create these assignments and add, for example, you'll see that we can add placeholders here, so I can create a very customized assignment description to be emailed to someone and notify them in, let's say, something like Microsoft Outlook very quickly and very easily.
Okay, another question. Where is
Yeah.
the voucher number coming from?
Right, so the voucher number is actually being generated in the accounts payable system.
Okay.
So that's actually coming from, in this case, GP. So what we're doing is as part of this workflow process, once we get to the appropriate step in the process, then we're going ahead and reaching out to GP, and that voucher is being generated and handed back to us.
Got it. Oh, here's another good question. I have stacks and stacks of old invoices and other AP boxes sitting in AP documents sitting in boxes. Can you give me some idea about best practices to sort them into M files and categorization?
Yes, so that's one of the things that we look to when we start to look at the whole process of how we're going to manage the information from coming from that capture system. That's where we'll start to take a look at exactly how we'll do that. So in this case, it may be that I take all of my invoices and I go ahead and include them in what we refer to as a batch over here. So you'll notice that I've got a number of different types of batches that allow me to manage different types of invoices. So I could have in an invoice batch, I could have maybe an HR batch or a contracts batch. So it understands how to manage that specific type of information. So we've been talking primarily about invoices here, and there's a number of different strategies that we see customers use around how to best handle that information. So for example, we'll see customers that use barcode separator sheets and oftentimes. We'll see that when we're using something like an advanced capture solution, that we may just put all of our invoices together and let the system take care of sorting those particular invoices out and going ahead and feeding them into the system. So there are some best practices that go into that. And that's where our professional services team will work with you to make sure that we understand the different types of documents that you're going to be working with and the best strategies to go ahead and bring those into the system. Good question. Thank you, Kimberly.
You are welcome. Here come a few more good ones. We had quite a few questions about does M-Files integrate with this system or that system. Can you sort of give us an overview regarding our approach to integration? Because I think that would answer most of the questions.
Right, right. So that's one of the so a lot of the systems that I've worked with in the past tend to have created integrations with other systems, and these tend to be very heavy integrations. So without getting into exactly how we do it, what I would suggest, what I would say is that part of the way that M-Files deals with this is by providing what we refer to as an external data connector. That external data connector is what allows us to integrate with other systems very seamlessly, very easily. So for example, Great Plains, SAP, other types of systems, what this allows us to do is basically create a connection. It could be an ODBC connection or some other type of an OLE-DB connection, a database level connection, sometimes an API level connection where we can go ahead and make requests directly from the system and then say, here are the fields that I want to go ahead and pull into M-Files. So that's very easy to configure, and that external database connector that we use allows us to integrate with, I would easily, 90% of the systems that we work with. Sometimes we will add some additional functionality in on top of that as necessary, but most of the time that being able to perform that level of integration it gets us the majority of the way that we need to be able to perform it. What that really does is that allows us to do a couple things. Number one, as products like Great Plains or SAP or other systems are growing and changing, we're not having to go back and re-architect our integration with those systems. We're not having to go through a heavy footprint type of an integration or reintegration. We can make quick changes to those integrations. Also, as we start to talk to customers that have, for example, their own in-house systems, homegrown systems, or maybe even taken some off-the-shelf system and made a lot of different customizations, which we see very frequently, we're able to make some modifications to that external database connector very quickly, very easily, without having to go in and write a bunch of code to make that work.
Okay, another question. I am a startup and I'd like a solution that will help me manage electronic documents for my clients. My clients are different customers that are not currently using an archiving solution. I want each customer to have a separate account. Can you talk a little bit about how M-Files would enable me to do that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we did, I showed the administration facility earlier. So one of the things that we have the ability to do is to go in and create these additional object classes within the system. So for example, I'm just going to use vendor as an example here. So let's just assume for a second that I didn't have another system that was managing this vendor information. I have the ability to go in and create these unstructured document classes directly within the M-file system. So that could be customer, that could be project, that could be any other type of classification that I might want to be able to go ahead and subdivide. You'll notice that I can have, so for example, I could add a property in here such as maybe contact name and have workflows dedicated to that specific customer. So I might want to say, okay, my primary contact for customer ABC is Stephen O'Neill. So whenever we get new requests from that customer, then they're automatically going to get routed to Stephen O'Neill, and he's going to be able to respond to them appropriately. So we see customers being able to go in and create that type of unstructured information like you're talking about there, Kimberly, very easily within the M-file system.
Got it. Here's another good question. I'd like to scan multiple document types and store them automatically to their proper vendors. Is this possible?
Yes, so that's part of what you saw us doing here. Part of the capture solution is that it was going ahead and it was capturing the appropriate vendor, and then based on that, it went ahead and passed that vendor information on indirectly. So for example, this invoice that came in, it automatically was able to associate it to the appropriate vendor. Now, if, for example, the vendor information had not been a match, so in this case, if we had not been able to match it to the A travel company, then we would have gone ahead and flagged that. So what this allows us to do is to start managing, instead of having to look at every single invoice and match every single invoice by hand, now what I'm able to do is I'm able to allow the advanced capture solution to pick that information up, to associate the vendor if it can, and in most cases it will be able to, and only leave those exceptions for me that it wasn't able to capture that information appropriately left for me to deal with. So that's properly architected. That's going to be something that we're going to be able to do for you automatically.
Is it possible to have different approvers based on the amount of the PO/invoice?
Yes, so that would be part of the workflow process. So for example, I could say that in this particular case, since this invoice is only $350, then it can go to Stephen O'Neill for approval. But if it's more than $1,000, then we're going to need to send it on to Kimberly for approval. And if it's over $500,000, then we need to send it on to the CEO for approval. So that can be built into the workflow process that I was showing you earlier.
Good. Good. I currently use M-Files and am curious how we can better leverage it for AP. Can I have a peek, and can you talk a little bit about the metadata structure in the administrator?
Yeah, so since you've given me the excuse to go and spend a little more time in the administrator, I will. So basically what we've done here, so I'll just kind of talk a little bit about a couple things that we did here. I will save my changes there real quick, and we'll come over here and we'll take a look. So for example, we've got a couple things going on here. So for example, that vendor information is configured right here. So with this vendor, you'll notice that if I come in here and look at these properties and look at this external database connection, this is where that information is being set up. So this is where I'm setting up the OLADB connection, the different fields that I want to capture, as well as how those fields are mapped from the source system, which is in this case the ERP system, to the target system. Also, when we look at, for example, perhaps an invoice, we would see the same type of thing. So we would see that we can go ahead. In this case, we're not setting up an integration because the invoice has actually been modeled directly within M-File. So this is where I would be able to go in and configure the specific invoice items or the specific invoice fields that I want to be able to see within M-Files. These are very easy to change. So if I want to go in and I want to add additional fields to this invoice process, if I wanted to add a primary contact, for example, that would be easy to configure right here within the system. I'm not going to do it because this is a live system, but it's literally just a point and click by going into add. Now, and then we'll see we've also got our information here for our invoice rows, as well as our purchase orders. So this is all configured as part of the M-Files administration. And it's very simple to create these new object types and classes so that we can see the information and integrate them and marry them up with the appropriate source system.
Okay, we got another good question. By the way, that was a really good answer. What is the average setup time to create the files and implement? Is there, yeah, hard question to answer.
Well, I think what the focus behind M-Files as a solution is to make this as easy as possible to do. So we want to, as we kind of talked a little about earlier in the beginning of this demonstration or in my presentation, is that fine line between, we want a system that's very easy to use for users, and it's easy to embrace from a UI perspective, but also very easy to configure on the admin side. That said, as opposed to trying to have those heavy integrations to integrate with those systems, we find that our integration times are a fraction of what we see some of our competitors having to do. And having worked with some of those other competitive tools, I can validate that. I mean, it's a very easy system to set up and get going very quickly and easily. That said, it's going to depend on each situation. We have customers that are able to roll out our solution in a week or two's time frame for small to medium-sized businesses. We see larger organizations that might spend maybe a month as opposed to 7 or 8 months. As a general rule, I think what you're going to find is that the M-File solution, we're going to be able to roll this out in a fraction of the time that you would see from some of our competitors in the industry.
Good answer. How can M-Files help a business, say a car dealership, connect sales to finance to AP?
Oh, that's a great question. And so, a couple different things here. So you'll notice that when we're looking at an invoice, that we've got these relationships here. So we've got a vendor relationship, we've got a purchase order relationship. So I could add, for example, I could come in here into this vendor, into this particular profile that's been configured, and that I configured in the administrator, and I could add additional items here that would allow me to create the relationships between those. So for example, I could have, let's just use the example of a contract. So I have a contract, it's associated to a specific vendor, it's associated to a specific customer, as well as to a specific project. And so I would be able to have all of those fields showing up on the metadata card, and when I'm looking at that particular contract, I would be able to see all of those different relationships showing up right underneath that specific document. So that's easily configured within the system, and that's really one of the strengths of the M-File system as a whole, but also that metadata-driven approach is that we have that ability to see all of those relationships based on the way that the system has been architected.
Thank you, Stephen. That was a really good QA. Really appreciate that. And I'd like to thank you all today for participating and joining us today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send them to us at sales@m-files.com. You can also find a lot of helpful information about M-Files, enterprise information management, and back office processes like accounts payable and invoicing at m-files.com. Have a great rest of the week, and we look forward to continuing the discussion soon.